The Boeing 757 hung through the afternoon sky at 35,000 feet, but Sarah Martinez barely noticed the familiar sensation of flight. She pressed her forehead against the cool window of seat 13F, watching the patchwork farmlands of Kansas drift by below, like a living map. The geometric patterns of wheat fields and irrigation circles stretched endlessly toward the horizon, each one representing lives and stories she'd never know. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't wearing a uniform. The jeans felt strange against her legs, stiff and unfamiliar after months of flight suits and dress blues. So did the simple, navy sweater her sister Elena had bought her for Christmas, the one that had hung unworn in her closet while she commanded the 455th Fighter Squadron through the dusty heat of Bagram Airfield. The soft wool felt almost luxurious against her skin, a stark contrast to the tactical gear and Kevlar she'd grown accustomed to wearing. Sarah shifted in her seat, still unconsciously maintaining the perfect posture that had been drilled into her at the academy 20 years ago. Her hands rested precisely on the armrests, her feet flat on the floor, alert even in repose. Old habits, she thought ruefully. Her commanding officer, General Patricia Hayes, had practically ordered her to take this leave. "Martinez," the general had said, leaning back in her chair with a knowing smile. "You've been running on caffeine and determination for 2 years straight. Your squadron is home safe. Your mission reports are filed. And if I see you in my office before May 1st, I'm personally going to have the MPs escort you to the nearest beach. Now finally take that mandated rest." She was just another passenger on United Flight 847 from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. Just Sarah Martinez, not Colonel Martinez, not Phoenix, not the woman whose tactical innovations had saved Forward Operating Base Chapman from being overrun. Just a tired officer visiting her aging mother in Arlington, Virginia. First time flying commercial in a while. Sarah turned to find the flight attendant, a woman about her age with kind brown eyes and gray temples pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag read Jennifer Walsh, and her smile held the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent years managing the anxieties of nervous flyers. "Something like that," Sarah replied, offering a small smile in return. Jennifer refilled Sarah's coffee cup with the precision of someone who'd mastered the art of pouring at altitude. The rich aroma mixed with the recycled air of the cabin, creating that unique atmosphere of commercial aviation. Part anticipation, part resignation, entirely familiar to anyone who'd spent their life in the sky. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, her experienced eye taking in details that most passengers would miss. Sarah's perfect posture, the way her eyes automatically tracked to the nearest emergency exits, the unconscious way she'd stowed her carry on with military precision. Everything squared away and secure. There was something about the way this passenger held herself, a bearing that spoke of discipline and command. "Military?" Jennifer asked quietly, her voice carrying the respect of someone who understood the weight of service. Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the coffee cup. She'd hoped to blend in, to disappear into the anonymous crowd of travelers, to be just another face among the 127 souls aboard this aircraft. But something about her demeanor, perhaps the way she'd automatically cataloged emergency procedures during the safety demonstration, or the instinctive way she'd assessed the flight crew during boarding, had given her away. "Air Force," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the steady drone of the engines. Jennifer's expression softened with immediate understanding. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to avoid disturbing nearby passengers. "My husband was Navy 22 years, 3 deployments to the Gulf. Retired last year as a senior chief." Her eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd lived through the unique challenges of military life. "The deployments, the missed holidays, the constant worry. I can always tell. It's something in the way you carry yourselves." She paused, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. Conversation remained private. "Thank you for your service, ma'am. Whatever you did over there, wherever it was for you, thank you." As Jennifer moved on to attend to other passengers, Sarah settled back into her seat, feeling both exposed and oddly comforted. Around her, the ordinary drama of civilian air travel continued to unfold in all its mundane complexity. The rhythms of normal life, as she'd almost forgotten, existed. In seat F-22, directly beside her, a businessman in his 40s pecked furiously at his laptop keyboard. His Bluetooth headset blinked steadily as he conducted what sounded like a heated conference call about quarterly projections and market penetration. Robert Kim, according to the name on the American Express card he'd used to purchase his overpriced airport sandwich. His world of spreadsheets and profit margins seemed impossibly distant from the life Sarah had been living. Across the narrow aisle, a young mother named Maria Santos struggled valiantly to keep her twin toddlers entertained. The boys, perhaps 3 years old, were fascinated by everything: the window shades, the tray tables, the overhead bins. Their father dozed fitfully beside them, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, exhaustion written across his features. A military ID card peeked from his wallet in the seat back pocket. Army, from the look of it, probably just returned from deployment himself. Sarah guessed, recognizing the particular bone, deep wariness that came from months of hypervigilance finally giving way to the safety of home. Behind her, a group of college students shared earbuds and laughed over something on their phones. Spring break, most likely heading home or to some beach destination. Their biggest worry probably their next exam or whether they'd remembered to set their DVRs. Their voices carried the easy confidence of youth, the assumption that the world was fundamentally safe and predictable. None of them knew that the quiet woman in the window seat had earned the call sign Phoenix after coaxing her damaged F-16 home through enemy fire over the Hindu Kush. None of them knew she'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions that had saved the lives of 200 Marines at a remote outpost, or that her face graced a recruitment poster in the Pentagon's Eat Ring corridor. To them, she was simply another passenger, maybe a teacher heading home for the weekend or a businesswoman on her way to a conference. Anonymous and unremarkable, exactly as she'd hoped to be. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember what normal felt like. When had she last sat somewhere without automatically identifying potential threats and escape routes? When had she last heard laughter that wasn't tinged with the gallows humor of combat? When had she last been surrounded by people whose biggest worry was a delayed connection rather than incoming mortar rounds? The steady vibration of the aircraft's twin engines created a soothing white noise, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt her shoulders beginning to relax. Outside her window, the American heartland continued to scroll by. Small towns connected by ribbons of highway, rivers meandering toward distant seas. The geometric precision of agricultural planning stretching toward horizons that held no threat of enemy fire. This was what she'd been fighting for. She realized not the abstract concepts of freedom and democracy that filled the speeches, but this mundane miracle of ordinary people living ordinary lives: the businessman worrying about his sales figures, a young mother managing her children's restless energy, the students planning their weekend adventures. The beautiful, complex tapestry of normal life that could only exist when warriors like her stood guard at the borders of chaos. Sarah allowed herself a small smile and settled deeper into her seat. For the next few hours, she was just another passenger on United Flight 847, just another American citizen enjoying the luxury of safe travel in peaceful skies. She had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, the skills that had made her a legend would be all that stood between 127 innocent people and disaster. For now, she was. content to watch Kansas drift below and remember what it felt like to be invisible. The first sign of trouble was a vibration so subtle that Sarah Martinez felt it in her bones before her conscious mind recognized the threat. Her eyes snapped open from their peaceful half-doze, instantly alert in the way that 18 months of combat flying had programmed into her nervous system. She instinctively checked her watch. 3:04:07 p.m. Mountain Time, exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes into what should have been a routine 5-hour flight. The vibration pulsed through the airframe like a heartbeat with an irregular rhythm, too low frequency to be turbulence, too persistent to be normal. Sarah's hand moved automatically to brace against the window frame as her pilot's instincts screamed danger. Around her, the other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their laptops and conversations and magazines, trusting in the reliability of modern aviation. But Sarah knew better. She'd felt this before in an F-16 over Kandahar province when her hydraulic pump had begun its death spiral. The aircraft was trying to tell them something, and whatever it was saying, it wasn't good news. Then the subtle vibration became a noticeable shudder. Coffee slashed in plastic cups. The businessman beside her looked up from his spreadsheet with mild annoyance, assuming they'd hit some rough air. Across the aisle, Maria Santos instinctively pulled her twin boys closer, her maternal instincts sensing something wrong. Even if she couldn't identify what, Captain Mike Thompson's voice crackled over the intercom system, his tone carrying that practiced airline calm. It was designed to reassure passengers even in the worst circumstances. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. We're going to need everyone to return to their seats and fasten your seat belts while we sort this out. Minor technical difficulties. Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She'd used those exact euphemistic words herself when her F-16's engine had caught fire at 25,000 ft over enemy territory when she'd been fighting to keep her aircraft airborne long enough to reach friendly airspace. The careful understatement that every pilot learned. Never panic the passengers. Never admit how bad things really are. The shudder intensified, becoming a violent shake that rattled the overhead bins and sent loose items sliding across tray tables. The businessman's laptop snapped shut with a sharp crack. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. The college students behind her stopped laughing mid-sentence, their youthful confidence suddenly replaced by uncertainty. Sarah's trained eye cataloged every symptom as the aircraft bucked and fought against invisible forces. The way the nose pitched slightly left and right, the irregular rhythm of the vibrations, the subtle changes in engine harmonics that most passengers wouldn't notice, but that screamed mechanical failure to anyone who'd spent their life listening to the language of aircraft in distress. Then came the sound that no passenger ever wants to hear. A grinding metallic screech from somewhere deep in the aircraft's belly, like giant gears stripping their teeth. It lasted for perhaps 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, the Sarah's military-trained mind processed a dozen possibilities. None of them good. Hydraulic failure had to be primary system, possibly secondary as well. The sound of backup pumps engaging and failing, of manual reversions kicking in, of flight controls fighting against mechanical resistance. Captain Thompson's voice returned to the intercom, and this time the careful airline composure had cracked just enough to reveal the steel beneath. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency procedures. Passengers, I need everyone to review your safety cards and prepare for a possible emergency landing. The word emergency cut through the cabin like a blade. The businessman's face went pale. Maria Santos gasped and clutched her children. Behind Sarah, someone whispered, "Oh God! Oh God! Oh God!" in a voice tight with panic. The oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments with a collective thunk that seemed to echo like gunshots. Suddenly, the cabin fell silent. Yellow plastic cups dangled on their elastic tethers like exotic flowers, swaying with each violent shake of the aircraft. Sarah was already reaching for her mask, her movements automatic and efficient when she felt the Boeing 757's nose pitch downward in a steep angle that made her stomach drop. This wasn't a controlled descent for landing preparation. This was an aircraft fighting its own flight controls, struggling against mechanical failure while gravity pulled it toward the earth below. Around her, panic erupted like a flash flood. The businessman beside her was hyperventilating into his oxygen mask, his eyes wide with terror. Maria Santos was crying as she struggled to get masks over her children's faces while they wailed in confusion and fear. Someone in the back of the cabin was screaming a high keening sound that cut through the chaos like a siren. The college students weren't laughing anymore. One of them, a young woman with blonde hair, was praying in rapid-fire Spanish. Her friend, a boy who couldn't have been older than 20, was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Throughout the cabin, 124 people were confronting their own mortality as the aircraft shuddered and bucked like a wild animal. Parents held children. The strangers grabbed each other's hands, business cards and cell phones, and all the detritus of modern life scattered across the tilted floor. As the Boeing fought against forces it was losing the power to control. But Sarah Martinez's mind had shifted into a different mode entirely, cold, analytical calm that had kept her alive through 100 combat missions over some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Her pilot's brain was already processing symptoms, calculating possibilities, running through emergency checklists that most people would never need to know. She recognized the signs with crystalline clarity. Multiple hydraulic system failure, probably caused by a catastrophic rupture in the main distribution line. The flight controls were operating on manual reversion, which meant the pilots were fighting to control a 180,000-pound aircraft using nothing but raw muscle and whatever mechanical advantage the control cables could provide. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and Sarah felt the deck angle increase as they entered what could only be described as an uncontrolled descent. Through her window, she could see the Colorado landscape rushing up to meet them, not in the gentle, controlled manner of a normal approach, but with the inexorable pull of gravity acting on a wounded bird. She'd been in this situation before, in a different aircraft over a different landscape. But the sick feeling in her stomach was exactly the same, the knowledge that everyone aboard, including herself, might not make it home to their families tonight. The understanding that in situations like this, the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions and the skill of the people in the cockpit. But this time, she wasn't in the cockpit. She was just a passenger in seat 13F, wearing civilian clothes, officially powerless to affect the outcome of this crisis. Except Sarah Martinez had never accepted powerlessness as an option. As the aircraft continued its terrifying dance with disaster, as parents held their children and strangers became allies in the face of shared peril, Sarah was already planning her next move. She might be out of uniform. She might be officially just another passenger. But she was still a pilot, still a warrior, still someone who had sworn an oath to protect others, regardless of whether she was wearing the insignia of that oath. The Boeing 757 rocked and shook around her, carrying 127 souls toward an uncertain fate. But Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez was no longer content to be just a passenger. It was time to go to work. Jennifer Walsh had been a flight attendant for 12 years. She had weathered everything from Category 5 hurricane diversions to medical emergencies at 40,000 feet. But she had never moved through a cabin quite like this one. Emergency training had prepared her for panic, but the reality was far more complex. A symphony of terror played out in individual variations across 124 passengers. At the front, An elderly woman clutched a rosary while her husband held her hand with trembling fingers. In the middle section, a teenage boy was live streaming the emergency on his phone until his mother grabbed the device and held him close. Toward the back, a group of businessmen sat in stunned silence, their confident facade cracked by the universal leveler of mortality. But as Jennifer made her way through the tilted cabin, checking oxygen masks and trying to project calm, she didn't entirely feel calm. Her attention kept returning to the woman in seat 13F, while everyone else displayed various degrees of panic or shock. This passenger sat with an almost supernatural composure, her eyes moving systematically around the cabin, not with fear, but with assessment. When Jennifer reached row 13, Sarah Martinez caught her arm with a grip that was firm but not desperate. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through the ambient chaos with startling clarity. "Jennifer," she said, using the flight attendant's name with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being heard in crisis situations, "I need to talk to the captain." Jennifer's first instinct was to deflect with standard procedure. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your mask on and remain in your seat. The pilots are handling the situation." "And I'm a pilot," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a weight that stopped Jennifer mid-sentence. "United States Air Force. I've dealt with hydraulic failures before, multiple system failures specifically. I can help." For a moment, Jennifer hesitated, her training warring with intuition. FAA regulations were clear about unauthorized personnel in the cockpit, but as the aircraft shuddered again and tilted further into its uncontrolled descent, protocol seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. "What kind of pilot?" Jennifer asked, leaning closer to hear over the noise of the struggling aircraft. "Fighter pilot. F-16s mostly. But I've flown everything from trainers to transports. I've brought damaged aircraft home before." Sarah's eyes never left Jennifer's face. "I've been exactly where your captain is right now." Another violent shake decided the matter. Jennifer reached for her master key. "Follow me." As they fought their way toward the front of the aircraft, Sarah grabbed the intercom set from its cradle near the galley. The cabin was awash in whispered prayers, muffled sobs, and the white noise of oxygen flowing through dozens of masks, but her voice cut through it all like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force." Her tone was calm, authoritative, utterly confident, the voice of someone who had stared death in the face before and refused to blink. "I want everyone to listen to me very carefully. We are going to get through this, but I need each of you to stay calm and follow all instructions from the flight crew. We have excellent pilots up front, and I'm going to help them bring us home safely." The effect was immediate and almost magical. The crying gave way to sniffles. The whispered panic gave way to focused attention. Even the college students behind her stopped their frightened murmuring and looked toward the front of the aircraft with something approaching hope. Robert Kim, the businessman beside her seat, caught her eye as she passed. "You're really Air Force." "Yes, sir. And we're going to be fine." She squeezed his shoulder briefly, a gesture both reassuring and somehow final, as if she was accepting responsibility for everyone aboard. At the cockpit door, Jennifer used her key with hands that shook slightly. Inside, Sarah found herself facing a scene that was both alien and familiar, the cramped cockpit of a commercial airliner instead of the familiar confines of an F-16, but the same desperate struggle between pilot and machine that she'd experienced over the mountains of Afghanistan. Captain Mike Thompson and First Officer Lisa Chun were fighting their aircraft with the grim determination of professionals who understood exactly how slim their margins had become. Sweat beaded on Thompson's forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Chun's knuckles were white on her control yoke. Both pilots wore the focused expression of people performing emergency procedures from memory. While death waited just outside the margins of their skill, Captain Sarah announced herself, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of emergency checklists and radio calls. Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force. I'd like to help if I can. Thompson's eyes flicked toward her civilian clothes, taking in her jeans and sweater with obvious skepticism. The last thing he needed was some self-important passenger claiming expertise she didn't possess. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this is a complex situation and you've lost primary hydraulic pressure, Sarah said, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with the rapid efficiency of someone reading familiar language. Backup system is failing or already failed. You're getting maybe 15 to 20% response from your flight controls. You're using differential thrust to maintain heading and fighting the yoke just to keep us airborne. Both pilots stared at her. Thompson's skeptical expression shifted toward surprise, then toward something approaching respect. That assessment had taken her exactly 12 seconds, and every word of it was accurate. Your angle of attack is increasing because you're losing elevator authority. Sarah continued, moving to the jump seat behind them without waiting for permission. You've got maybe 10 minutes before this becomes unrecoverable. How long to nearest suitable airport? Denver International. Sean replied automatically. 18 minutes at current ground speed. Too far, Sarah said grimly. We need alternatives. What about Air Force Academy, Buckley Space Force Base, any military field with long runways and crash equipment? As she spoke, Sarah was already mentally cataloging the emergency procedures that had saved her life over Afghanistan. Techniques for flying damaged aircraft that weren't taught in civilian flight schools, but were standard curriculum in military survival training. How do you know all this? Thompson demanded, his voice tight with stress and skepticism. Because I've been exactly where you are, Sarah replied, settling into the jump seat and reaching for the headset. Different aircraft, same problem. I brought an F-16 home through enemy fire with total hydraulic failure over the Hindu Kush. Your Boeing has redundancies. My Falcon didn't, but the physics are identical. She keyed the radio microphone, her voice shifting into the crisp professional tone of military aviation. Denver Center, United 8047. This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force. Call sign Phoenix. Now assisting the flight crew with emergency procedures. Request immediate vector to nearest suitable runway and full emergency services. The brief silence that followed her transmission told Sarah everything she needed to know. In air traffic control centers and military installations across the region, duty officers were processing what they just heard. Phoenix, the call sign that had become legend in fighter pilot circles, spoken in the same breath as Chuck Jagger and Robin Olds, United 847 Denver Center. The controller's voice carried a new note of respect mixed with disbelief. Confirm call sign Phoenix. Colonel Martinez confirmed. Denver Center. Phoenix is on station and ready to work. Sarah turned to Captain Thompson, who was watching her with an expression somewhere between hope and amazement. Mike, can I call you Mike? I need you to trust me. What I'm about to suggest is going to feel wrong, but it's the only way we're going to save this airplane. Thompson studied her face for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw something he recognized from his own worst moments in the cockpit. Calm that comes from having stared down disaster before and refused to yield. The quiet confidence of someone who had earned the right to ask for trust. What do you need? He asked. Sarah Martinez smiled for the first time since the emergency. Begin. I need you to let Phoenix fly. At Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, Controller Jake Morrison had been handling routine traffic for 6 hours when his carefully ordered world exploded into chaos. A radio transmission from United 47 stopped him cold, his hand freezing halfway to his coffee cup as the words, "Call sign Phoenix," echoed through his headset. Phoenix. Jake Morrison had been an Air Force controller before joining the FAA. He had spent 4 years at Bagram Airfield watching F-16s and A-10s launch into hostile skies. Every controller in military aviation knew that call sign not just because of the pilot who carried it, but because of what it represented. Phoenix wasn't just a name. It was a legend built on impossible odds, an extraordinary skill. Did she just say Phoenix? His supervisor, Carol Stevens, leaned over his shoulder, her own military background helping her recognize the significance of what they just heard. Yeah. Jake's hands were already moving across his console, pulling up emergency protocols and military liaison numbers. He keyed his microphone with the careful precision of someone who understood he was speaking to aviation royalty. Denver, send her to United 847. Confirm call sign Phoenix, Colonel Sarah Martinez. Sarah's voice came back through the static, crisp and professional despite the chaos surrounding her. Confirmed, Denver Center. Phoenix is on station and assisting with aircraft emergency. Request immediate coordination with military air traffic control and emergency services. Even over the radio, Jake could hear the unmistakable sounds of an aircraft in distress, the background noise of struggling engines, the subtle audio cues that told him United 847 was fighting for its life. But overlaying that mechanical symphony of failure was something else. Absolute calm and authority from the woman who had just identified herself as one of the most legendary pilots in modern Air Force history. Carol was already on the phone to Peterson Space Force Base, her voice urgent but controlled. This is Denver Center. We have an aircraft emergency involving Colonel Sarah Martinez. Call sign Phoenix. Yes, that Phoenix. We need immediate military coordination and possible fighter escort. The response was immediate. Within 90 seconds, alerts were flashing on screens across 3 military installations. At Peterson, the command duty officer was pulling up Sarah's service record, a document so classified that most of it appeared as black redacted lines. But what was visible told the story of a warrior whose exploits had become legend. At Buckley Space Force Base, Major Kevin Hawk Rodriguez was reviewing flight training schedules when his secure phone buzzed with an emergency alert. He read the message twice before the words sank in. United 847 in emergency. Phoenix on board. Assistance required. Holy, he whispered, then caught himself. Even in crisis, military bearing demanded better. But this was Phoenix, the pilot whose tactical innovations were taught at the Air Force Academy, whose actions over Afghanistan had saved forward operating base Chapman from being overrun, whose call sign was spoken with reverence in ready rooms from Langley to Kadena. Viper. He called to his wingman, Captain Amy Chun, who was across the ready room studying weather reports. Emergency scramble. We're escorting a civilian aircraft. What's the threat? Amy asked, already moving toward their gear. No threat. Guardian. Angel mission. Phoenix is aboard. She's helping fly a damaged airliner. Amy stopped mid-stride. Like every fighter pilot in the Air Force, she knew the Phoenix story, or rather the dozen Phoenix stories that had become part of military lore. The emergency landing in a sandstorm that saved her wingman's life, the solo mission behind enemy lines to extract a downed pilot, the tactical manual she'd written that was now required reading at the academy. Phoenix Martinez. That Phoenix. And she needs us. Within 4 minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors were rolling down the runway at Buckley, their afterburners painting the Colorado afternoon with controlled thunder. As they climbed toward their intercept point, Kevin was already coordinating with air traffic control, his mind racing through the implications of what he just learned. At Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, the news was spreading through the fighter wing like wildfire. Colonel Marcus Webb, Sarah's former commanding officer, and the man who had recommended her for the Distinguished Flying Cross, was in a briefing when his aide interrupted with a message that made him forget all about budget allocations and training schedules. Sir, We're getting reports that Colonel Martinez is aboard a civilian aircraft experiencing hydraulic failure. She's assisting with emergency procedures. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, seeing not the graying colonel who'd visited his office 6 months ago, but the young captain who'd walked into his squadron 12 years earlier with fire in her eyes and skills that defied explanation. Get me a direct line to Denver Center. I want real-time updates. At the Pentagon, duty officers were already briefing senior staff. The Secretary of the Air Force was being awakened from a rare afternoon nap. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, cadets were abandoning their afternoon classes to crowd around radios in the squadron common rooms, listening to emergency frequencies chatter with updates about their hero. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Retired Air Force pilots across the country who monitored emergency frequencies as a hobby. Veterans who'd served with Sarah or under her command. Flight instructors who taught her or learned from her innovations. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, Master Sergeant Tony Castellanos was reviewing maintenance schedules when a junior airman burst into his office. "Sergeant, you need to hear this. Phoenix is on the emergency frequency. She's helping fly a damaged civilian aircraft. Tony had served under Sarah during her squadron command. Had watched her bring home pilots who should have died. Had seen her make decisions under pressure that left seasoned warriors shaking their heads in admiration." He grabbed his radio, tuned to the emergency frequency, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the volume. "This is Denver Center to United 8047, the controller's voice crackled through the static. "Military escort is inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Colonel Martinez, we have hawk flight of F-22s from Buckley en route to provide assistance." Sarah's response came through calm and professional. "Denver Center, Phoenix, appreciate the escort. We're maintaining course for Denver International, but I need you to coordinate with approach control. We're going to need every foot of runway they can give us, and this approach is going to be ... unconventional." Tony smiled despite his worry. Even in an emergency. Phoenix maintained her legendary understatement. Unconventional. From Sarah Martinez usually meant something that would be impossible for anyone else. As word continued to spread through military channels, a remarkable thing began happening at air bases across the country. Off-duty personnel who heard about Phoenix being aboard the troubled aircraft began gathering in operations centers and ready rooms, following the emergency on military frequencies. Pilots who'd flown with her, maintainers who'd serviced her aircraft, controllers who'd guided her home for missions. All united by respect for a warrior who'd earned her place in the pantheon of aviation legends. At Edwards Air Force Base, test pilots paused their experimental flights to listen. At Shaw Air Force Base, 10 pilots gathered around radios, remembering the joint training exercises where Sarah had taught them close air support techniques that saved lives. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, pilots 6 time zones ahead stayed up past midnight to follow the emergency. The story was bigger now than just one aircraft in distress. It had become a moment when the entire military aviation community held its collective breath, waiting to see if their legendary Phoenix could rise from the ashes one more time. And somewhere over the Colorado landscape, at the controls of a Boeing 757 with failing hydraulics and 127 souls on board, Colonel Sarah Martinez was about to remind the world why legends are born from moments when ordinary people do extraordinary things. At 39,000 feet above the snow-capped peaks of the Colorado Rockies, United Flight 8047 looked like a wounded eagle fighting against gravity itself. Major Kevin Hawk Rodriguez eased his F-22 Raptor into formation 500 feet off the airliner's right wing. The contrast between the sleek fighter and the struggling commercial aircraft telling the story of 2 different worlds of aviation. Suddenly, united by crisis, the Boeing 757 wallowed through the thin air, its control surfaces moving in erratic, jerky motions as the flight crew fought to maintain even basic stability. From his cockpit, Kevin could see the telltale signs of an aircraft in severe distress. The slight nose-down attitude that indicated loss of elevator authority, the wings that rocked unpredictably despite the calm air, the engine exhaust temperatures that suggested the pilots were using differential thrust to maintain control. United 847, Hawk Flight has you in sight, Rodriguez radioed, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that had made him one of the Air Force's most respected pilots. Phoenix, it's Major Rodriguez. How can we assist? Inside the commercial airliner's cockpit, Sarah Martinez was deep in what fighter pilots called the zone. That state of hyper-aware calm where time seemed to slow down and complex problems became manageable puzzles. Her hands moved across the unfamiliar Boeing instruments with growing confidence. Years of emergency training translating across aircraft types with the fluidity of someone who truly understood the science of flight. Hawk Flight, Phoenix. Good to hear friendly voices up here. Sarah's transmission carried just a hint of her legendary dry humor even in the midst of crisis. We're looking at Denver International for emergency landing. But first, I need you to coordinate some magic with approach control. She paused to help Captain Thompson adjust their heading as the aircraft's compromised flight controls fought against even small course corrections. First Officer Chun was managing their emergency checklist with methodical precision, her calm professionalism providing the steady rhythm that kept the cockpit functioning despite the chaos. I need runway 660R cleared and held, Sarah continued. Every piece of emergency equipment they can muster. And Kevin, I know you're thinking textbook approach procedures, but throw that manual out the window. We're going to be coming in fast, steep, and probably sideways. This is going to be all about energy management and hoping we can bleed off enough speed before we run out of runway. Copy that, Phoenix. Already coordinating with Denver Tower. But even as Kevin acknowledged her request, his mind was processing the implications of what he just heard. Sarah Martinez, the Phoenix, was essentially telling him that she was about to attempt a landing that would challenge every principle of commercial aviation safety. And yet, if anyone could pull off the impossible, it was the pilot whose call sign had become synonymous with miraculous recoveries. In his left seat, Captain Amy Vipercon was monitoring emergency frequencies as military installations across the region checked in with offers of assistance. The response was unprecedented, not just because of the civilian aircraft in distress, but because of who was helping to fly it. Hawk, this is Cheyenne Mountain. We're tracking your emergency. Be advised, we have Phoenix's complete service record on screen. Her innovations in damaged aircraft recovery are ... impressive. Kevin smiled grimly. Impressive was military understatement at its finest. Sarah's techniques for flying compromised aircraft had been incorporated into Air Force training manuals. After she'd successfully landed 3 different aircraft that should have killed her, including the legendary incident over Afghanistan when she'd brought home an F-16 with 70% of its control surfaces destroyed by enemy fire. Cheyenne Mountain, Hawk Phoenix's ... Phoenix. She's got this. But the weight of expectation was building with each radio transmission. At Nellis Air Force Base, Master Sergeant Castellanos was coordinating with a dozen other bases as reports came in from across the military aviation community. Former wingmen, ground crews who'd serviced her aircraft, controllers who'd guided her through combat zones. All were monitoring the emergency frequency, waiting to see if their legendary pilot could work another miracle. Peterson, this is Nellis Maintenance. Phoenix once dead-sticked a battle, damaged Falcon through a sandstorm to save her wingmen. If anyone can bring home a busted Boeing, it's her. The response from Peterson's Space Force Base carried the voice of someone who clearly knew Sarah personally. Nellis, this is Colonel Webb at Peterson. I was Phoenix's squadron commander in Afghanistan. She's going to save every soul on that aircraft or die trying. Have emergency services ready for anything." Inside the cockpit of United 8047, Sarah was oblivious to the growing legend being built. Around her emergency landing attempt, her entire world had narrowed to airspeed indicators, attitude displays, and the delicate balance of keeping 180,000 lbal of aluminum and humanity airborne on barely responsive controls. "Mike," she said to Captain Thompson, "I need you to start thinking like a test pilot. Everything we're about to do is going to feel wrong. We're going to approach faster than any commercial aircraft should. We're going to use techniques that aren't in any civilian manual. But trust me, I've been here before." Thompson's hands were steady on his controls, but sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool cockpit air. "Sarah, I've got 23 years with this airline. I've never had a passenger save my aircraft before, and I've never been a passenger on someone else's emergency." Sarah replied with a slight smile. Guests were both breaking new ground. Today, through the cockpit windows, they could see the F-22s holding perfect formation, their pilots ready to provide whatever assistance possible. It was a sight that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances. America's most advanced fighters escorting a commercial airliner like protective guardian angels. Denver approach, United 847. With Hawk flight escort, Sarah radioed as they began their long descent toward the airport. "Be advised, this approach is going to be non-standard. We'll be using military emergency procedures adapted for civilian aircraft. I need you to clear all traffic within 20 mi of the field." United 847. Denver approach. "Sir, I mean Mom. Colonel Martinez, you're cleared for any approach you deem necessary. All traffic has been diverted. Emergency services are standing by." The controller's voice carried a note of awe that wasn't lost on Sarah. Word had clearly spread about who was helping to fly the damaged aircraft. She keyed her microphone one more time, her voice carrying across military and civilian frequencies. To the hundreds of people now following their emergency, all stations, this is Phoenix. We're coming home. Stand by. At Denver International Airport, fire trucks and ambulances were taking position along runway HUF-60R. Air traffic controllers watched their radar screens with unprecedented attention. News crews, despite security restrictions, were setting up cameras on distant concourses. And across the military aviation community, from ready rooms to maintenance hangars to operations centers around the world, people who understood the science, an art of flying, were holding their breath, waiting to see if the pilot they called Phoenix could rise from the ashes. One more time, the legend was about to be tested in the most public way possible, with 127 lives hanging in the balance, and the eyes of the aviation world watching her every move. News traveled through the aviation community with the speed of light, carried by radio waves, social media, and the invisible networks that connect warriors across time and distance. What had begun as a routine emergency was transforming into something unprecedented, a moment when an entire community rallied around one of their own. At Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, the response was swift and emotional. Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the base operations center, surrounded by active duty and retired personnel who had gathered to monitor the emergency frequency. The large screen displayed a real-time radar track of United 847's descent toward Denver, flanked by the distinctive signatures of 2 F-22 escorts. "That's my pilot up there," Marcus said quietly to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the pride of a commander who had watched Sarah Martinez grow from a promising young captain into the Air Force's most legendary aviator. 23 years I've been in this business, and I've never seen anyone fly like Phoenix. Behind him, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation to the F-22 pilot, but a veteran crew chief who had serviced Sarah's aircraft during 3 deployment rotations, nodded grimly. Colonel Martinez brought home birds that should have killed her. Sir, if anyone can save that airliner, it's Phoenix. The gathering wasn't limited to active duty personnel. Word had spread through the military retiree community with remarkable speed. Colonel James Shark Patterson, who had flown combat missions with Sarah over Afghanistan, had driven 40 minutes from his civilian job to stand vigil with his former squadron mates. Major Jennifer Ghost Williams, now an airline pilot herself, had called in sick to her scheduled flight just to be present for this moment. I flew wingman with Phoenix on the mission that got her the DFC. Ghost said, her voice tight with emotion. Enemy SAMs knocked out her hydraulics, damaged her engine, and she still completed the mission and brought us both home. She's going to save every person on that aircraft. The scene was being replicated at military installations across the globe. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, pilots 6 time zones ahead had stayed up past midnight, crowding into the squadron-ready room to follow the emergency on shortwave radios. At Osan Air Base in South Korea, F-16 pilots interrupted their pre-dawn briefings to listen to updates from Denver. But the response extended far beyond the military community. At Denver International Airport, the unprecedented nature of the emergency had created controlled chaos throughout the facility. Airport Operations Manager Susan Morrison had worked at DEN for 22 years, had managed everything from blizzard closures to security incidents, but had never seen anything like the coordinated response now unfolding around runway Fix 60R. I count 37 emergency vehicles staged along the runway, she reported over her radio to the airport command center. Fire suppression, medical, crash recovery, hazmat, everything we've got and more. Colorado State Patrol has provided additional ambulances, and the National Guard is sending helicopter support from Buckley. The response wasn't just official. Retired airline pilots from across the Denver metro area had begun arriving at the airport, showing their credentials to security and asking permission to help with whatever might be needed. Captain Bill Stevens, who had flown for United for 31 years before retiring, stood on Concourse B with binoculars, watching the approach path for the first sign of United 847. Never seen a military escort for a civilian emergency, he said to the small crowd of aviation professionals who had gathered around him. That pilot there, talking about Phoenix, she must be something special. At nearby Buckley Space Force Base, the phenomenon was even more remarkable. Off-duty personnel who had heard about the emergency were arriving at the base gates, asking permission to observe the landing attempt. Families of military members, veterans from the surrounding communities, even civilian aviation enthusiasts who monitored emergency frequencies. All were converging on the one location where they might witness history. Tech Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who worked in base communications, found herself coordinating not just military radio traffic, but civilian media requests from around the world. CNN, Fox News, NBC, every major network was requesting live feeds from the base. Aviation Week magazine had dispatched a photographer. The military channel was broadcasting live updates. "Ma'am," she said to her supervisor, Major Lisa Chun, "I've got requests from 19 different news organizations. They all want to cover the Phoenix landing. Tell them they can observe from the designated media area." Major Chun replied, "But this is still a military installation with security protocols, and make sure they understand the focus needs to be on the successful recovery of that aircraft and its passengers, not on creating a spectacle." The story had indeed become a spectacle, but of a different kind than the media anticipated. Social media was exploding with posts from people who had served with, worked for, or been trained by Colonel Sarah Martinez. Hashtags 5PhoenixN47 and Hey Bring Them Home were trending worldwide. But the posts weren't seeking attention or glory. They were expressions of faith in a pilot whose reputation had been built on impossible rescues and miraculous recoveries. From a retired Air Force maintainer in Arizona, Phoenix saved my son's life in Afghanistan. She brings everyone home. Phoenix 847. From a commercial pilot in Chicago, learned emergency procedures from Colonel Martinez at a safety seminar. If you're going to have an emergency, you want Phoenix in the cockpit. Bring them home. From a military spouse in North Carolina. My husband flew with Phoenix. She never left anyone behind. Never will. Praying for United 8047. But perhaps the most significant response was happening in the most unexpected place aboard United Flight 847 itself. Maria Santos, the young mother with twin boys, had been listening to the radio chatter through the aircraft's entertainment system. When she learned that the woman helping in the cockpit was a decorated war hero, she began moving through the cabin, sharing the information with other passengers. The pilot helping us. She told an elderly couple in row 15 she's a real Air Force colonel. She's famous for saving people. The businessman, Robert Kim, who had abandoned his laptop hours ago, found himself in conversation with the college students behind him. My brother's in the Air Force, one of them said, is always talking about some pilot called Phoenix, says she's like a legend or something. That's her, Robert replied, his voice filled with wonder. The legend is flying our plane. Throughout the cabin, 124 passengers were beginning to understand that they weren't just experiencing a routine emergency. They were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment when a hero who had spent her career saving others was being called upon one more time to work a miracle. And as United 847 continued its descent toward Denver International Airport, with F-22 the Raptors holding protective formation and emergency crews standing ready on the ground below, an entire community of warriors, aviators, and ordinary citizens held their collective breath, waiting to see if the pilot they called Phoenix could rise from the ashes one more time. The legend was about to face its greatest test, with the eyes of the world watching and 127 lives hanging in the balance. The approach to runway 60R at Denver International Airport was unlike anything in aviation history. At 4:47 p.m. Mountain Time, with the Colorado sun casting long shadows across the Front Range, United Flight 847 began its final descent under the guidance of the most unlikely flight crew ever assembled, an airline captain, his first officer, and a legendary Air Force colonel who had been nothing more than a passenger in seat 13F just 2 hours earlier. Sarah Martinez sat in the cockpit jump seat. Her civilian clothes were in stark contrast to the professional uniforms surrounding her, but her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had stared down death in the skies above Afghanistan and emerged victorious. Her hands moved across the unfamiliar bowing instrumentation with the fluid confidence of a master musician playing a new piece on a familiar piano. Denver approach, United 47 beginning final approach runway 60R, she radioed, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of emergency frequencies. Be advised, we're going to be fast and steep. I need that runway held clear and every piece of crash equipment positioned for immediate response. United 8047 Denver approach. All traffic diverted. Runway clear. Emergency services in position. Colonel Martinez, the entire aviation community is pulling for you. Through the cockpit windows, the landscape of eastern Colorado spread below them like a vast canvas of autumn colors. The Rocky Mountains rose majestically to the west, their snow-capped peaks catching the late afternoon light. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on the mathematical precision required to bring 180,000 lb of damaged aluminum and 127 precious lives safely to Earth. Mike, she said to Captain Thompson, who gripped his control yoke with the steady determination of a 23-year veteran, we're going to come in at 180 knots instead of the normal 140. The hydraulic failure means we can't use speed brakes effectively. So we need extra airspeed for control authority. It's going to feel like we're screeching toward the ground, but trust the physics. Thompson's knuckles were white, but his voice remained steady. "Sarah, in all my years flying, I've never had to do anything like this. And in all my years, I've never tried to save a Boeing with airline procedures." Sarah replied with a slight smile that somehow conveyed both confidence and humanity. "Wes, we're both expanding our horizons today. Lisa," she turned to First Officer Chun, "I need you to call out airspeed every 10 knots. We're going to be riding the edge of a stall all the way down." Above them, Major Kevin Rodriguez in his F-22 Val's Raptor was coordinating with what had become an unprecedented assembly of military and civilian aircraft. "Denver Tower Hawk Flight. Be advised we have visual on United 847 beginning final approach. Aircraft appears stable, but maintaining unusual approach angle. Roger, Hawk Flight. All emergency services report ready. Colonel Martinez. You are cleared to land any runway, any direction, any way you see fit." The response from Denver Tower carried a weight that transcended normal air traffic control procedures. This wasn't just another emergency landing. It was a moment when an entire community's faith rested on the skills of one extraordinary pilot. At Denver International, the scene along runway 5660R resembled a military operation more than a civilian emergency response. 39 emergency vehicles lined the runway and adjacent taxiways. Fire trucks with specialized aircraft firefighting foam, ambulances equipped for mass casualty events, crash recovery equipment, hazmat teams, and mobile command centers. Colorado Air National Guard helicopters circled at a safe distance, their crews ready to provide additional medical evacuation if needed. Fire Chief Robert Martinez, no relation to Sarah but proud to share her surname, stood in the command vehicle coordinating with incident commanders from multiple agencies. "All units, this is command. Aircraft is on final approach. Based on the pilot's reputation and the military escort, we're expecting a successful recovery. But be ready for anything. This landing is going to be unconventional." In the passenger cabin of United 847, 124 souls were experiencing the strange calm that comes after terror has exhausted itself. The initial panic had given way to focused determination as passengers followed the flight attendants' instructions with the precision of people who understood their survival depended on cooperation. Maria Santos held her twin boys close, whispering reassurances that she hoped were true. "The nice lady pilot is going to get us home safe. She's done this before." Around her, strangers had become allies. The businessman Robert Kim was helping an elderly passenger review emergency procedures. The college students were assisting other passengers with seat belt adjustments and carry-on storage. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant who had first recognized Sarah's military bearing, moved through the cabin with calm efficiency. But her professional composure couldn't entirely hide the awe in her voice as she made her final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Denver International Airport. The pilot assisting our flight crew is Colonel Sarah Martinez, whose call sign Phoenix represents one of the most distinguished careers in military aviation. We are in exceptional hands." The cabin fell silent except for the changed note of the engines as Captain Thompson began reducing power for their approach. Through the windows, passengers could see the two F-22 fighters holding formation, sleek gray guardians against the Colorado sky. 1,000 FT. First Officer Chun called out, her voice steady despite the unprecedented nature of their approach. "Airspeed and 95 knots. Good," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning instrument displays that told the story of an aircraft fighting physics with damaged systems and human skill. "Mike, start your flare at 50 feft, but keep it shallow. We want to fly this airplane onto the runway, not." Through her headset, Sarah could hear radio chatter from across the aviation community, updates from military bases, coordination between emergency services, even civilian pilots monitoring the frequency from airports hundreds of miles away. The weight of expectation was enormous, but it was also familiar. She had carried the hopes of others before over hostile territory, where failure meant not just her own death, but the deaths of the Marines she was protecting. 500 Feft, Shan announced. Airspeed 182. The runway rushed up to meet them. A ribbon of concrete that represented safety, home, and the successful completion of a mission that had begun with Sarah simply trying to take a vacation. Emergency vehicles raced alongside their approach path, their red and white lights creating a corridor of hope through the gathering dusk. 200 Fate, speed 180. Sarah's voice cut through the tension with the calm authority that had made her legendary. Flare now, Mike. Easy. Pressure back. Let her settle. That's it. The main landing gear touched the runway with barely more impact than a normal landing, the massive Boeing 757 settling onto the concrete with the grace of a bird coming home to roost. But their challenge wasn't over. With no hydraulic pressure for wheel brakes and limited steering, they were still traveling at highway speeds down a runway with very finite length. Reverse thrust maximum, Sarah commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. Lisa, call out our speed. 100 knots. 9280. The aircraft shuddered as Captain Thompson pulled the throttle levers into full reverse, the engines screaming in protest as they fought to slow 180,000 lbf of momentum. Emergency vehicles paced them on parallel taxiways, ready to respond if the aircraft couldn't stop before running out of runway. 60 knots, 50. Finally, mercifully, United Flight 847 rolled to a complete stop just 800 wide from the end of runway 56R. The silence in the cockpit was profound, broken only by the sound of 3 people breathing heavily and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. Captain Thompson's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and disbelief. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International Airport. The cabin erupted in applause, tears, and prayers of gratitude, but Sarah Martinez, still wearing the jeans and sweater that had marked her as just another passenger 3 hours earlier, wasn't finished yet. Mike, Lisa, she said quietly, we need to get these people off this aircraft quickly and safely. The emergency is not over until everyone's on the ground. As the first emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and portable stairs approached the main door, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. Through the cockpit window, she could see something that made her catch her breath. Military personnel were arriving at the airport, not just the expected accident investigators and officials, but active duty and retired Air Force members from across Colorado. Word had spread through the aviation community with lightning speed, and they had come to honor one of their own. Major Rodriguez stood near the aircraft in his flight suit, having landed his F-22 at nearby Buckley Air Force Base before racing to Denver. Behind him, a growing crowd of military personnel waited in respectful formation. Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez was about to discover that heroes don't just save lives. They inspire communities, unite strangers in common cause, and remind the world that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when called upon to serve something greater than themselves. The first passenger to emerge from United Flight 8047 was 8-year-old Danny Wilson, his small hand gripping his mother's tightly as they descended the portable stairs onto the tarmac at Denver International Airport. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete, and the boy's eyes went wide as he took in the unprecedented scene surrounding their aircraft. Dozens of emergency vehicles, military personnel in dress uniforms, and news cameras capturing every moment. "Mom, look," Danny whispered, pointing toward the formation of Air Force personnel standing at rigid attention near the aircraft. "They're all saluting." Linda Wilson followed her son's gaze and felt tears spring to her eyes. She had heard the announcements, had listened to the other passengers talking about the Air Force colonel who had helped save their lives. But seeing the military's response made the reality hit home with stunning force. Her family had been saved by a genuine American hero. Behind them, The stream of passengers continued, each person carrying not just their luggage, but the weight of having witnessed something extraordinary. Maria Santos emerged with her twin boys, pausing at the bottom of the stairs to look back at the aircraft that had brought them safely home. Robert Kim, a businessman who had abandoned his quarterly projections in favor of prayer, stepped onto the tarmac with tears streaming down his face. Inside the cockpit, Sarah Martinez was completing the final shutdown procedures with Captain Thompson and First Officer Chun. Her hands moved across the Boeing's controls one last time, securing systems and ensuring the aircraft was safe for the investigation teams that would soon swarm over every component of the damaged hydraulic systems. "Sarah," Captain Thompson said quietly, his voice still strained from the stress of the past 3 hours. "I've been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. I've never experienced anything like what you just did. You didn't just help us land this airplane. You saved 127 lives." Sarah looked up from the checklist she was completing, her expression carrying the humble dignity that had marked her entire career. "Mike, you and Lisa did the flying. I just provided some technical consultation. This was a team effort from beginning to end." First Officer Chun shook her head with a slight smile. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that was the most extraordinary display of airmanship I've ever witnessed. You took a situation that should have been catastrophic and made it look almost routine." Before Sarah could respond, Jennifer Walsh appeared at the cockpit door. The flight attendant's professional composure had finally cracked, and tears were visible in her eyes as she spoke. "Colonel Martinez, there are some people outside who would like to see you." Sarah followed Jennifer through the aircraft's man door and stepped into a scene that took her breath away. On the tarmac below, she found herself facing a formation of military personnel that seemed to have materialized from every corner of Colorado's aviation community. Active duty officers, retired veterans, Air National Guard members, even military spouses and children, all standing in respectful formation. At the front of the group stood Major Kevin Rodriguez, still wearing his flight suit from the F-22 escort mission. His wingman, Captain Amy Chun, stood beside him. Behind them, Sarah recognized faces from across her career, former squadron mates, pilots she had trained, ground crew members who had serviced her aircraft during countless deployments. "Colonel Martinez," Major Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying across the tarmac with military precision. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and the aviation community, we request permission to render honors." Sarah felt a moment of overwhelming emotion as she realized what was happening. These weren't just military personnel paying respects to a superior officer. These were warriors honoring one of their own, recognizing not just her actions on this day, but the lifetime of service that had led to this moment. "Permission granted," she replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence in her heart. Major Rodriguez snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. His wingmen followed immediately. Then, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, every military member present came to attention and saluted: active duty, retired, officers, enlisted, representing every branch of service, but united in their respect for the woman who had just reminded the world what it meant to answer the call when duty demanded everything. The moment stretched across the tarmac with profound silence, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines and the click of news cameras, capturing an image that would grace front pages across the nation. Sarah Martinez, still, wearing the civilian clothes she had put on that morning for a simple flight home. Sarah Martinez stood perfectly erect and returned the salute with the same precision she had learned as a cadet 26 years earlier. Behind the military formation, civilian observers had gathered as well: airport workers, airline employees, passengers from other flights who had been delayed by the emergency, all watching with the kind of reverence usually reserved for state funerals or medal ceremonies. Some were crying, others held up phones to record a moment they understood was historic. As the salute concluded, individual members of the formation began to step forward. Master Sergeant Tony Castellanos, who had served under Sarah during 2 deployment rotations, was the first to approach. "Colonel, it's an honor to see you again, ma'am. You haven't changed?" Still making the impossible look easy. Behind him came others, each carrying their own piece of the Phoenix legend. Captain Janet Spike Williams, whom Sarah had trained as a young lieutenant, now an instructor pilot herself. Chief Master Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, who had been the senior enlisted member in her squadron during the Afghanistan deployment that had made her famous. "Phoenix," he said simply, using her call sign with the familiarity of someone who had watched her launch into hostile skies night after night. "You brought us all home then, and you brought them home today. Some things never change." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Danny Wilson broke away from his mother and approached Sarah with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Ma'am, are you really a fighter pilot?" Sarah knelt down to meet his eyes, her expression softening into the warmth that her squadron members had always seen, but the public rarely witnessed. "I am Nanny, and today I got to help Captain Thompson and First Officer Chun fly your airplane home safely. My dad says fighter pilots are the bravest people in the world." Danny continued with 8-year-old logic. "Are you brave?" Sarah considered the question seriously, the way she would any technical inquiry about aviation or tactics. "I think brave people are just regular people who do what needs to be done when others are counting on them. Today, everyone on that airplane was brave. Your mom, the other passengers, the flight crew. We all worked together. Will you sign my boarding pass?" Danny asked, producing the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I'd be honored," Sarah replied, taking out her pen and writing carefully to Danny. "Remember that heroes are ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Aim high. Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez, USAF." As she handed the boarding pass back to the boy, Sarah noticed that other passengers were approaching with their own requests. Maria Santos wanted her to meet her children, who were fascinated by the idea that a real pilot lady had saved their flight. Robert Kim simply wanted to shake her hand and thank her. The college students asked for a group photo that they promised to treasure forever. What struck Sarah most profoundly was not the recognition from her military colleagues, though that meant more to her than she could express, but the impact on the civilian passengers who had shared her unexpected journey from seat 13F to the cockpit of a crippled airliner. As the crowd began to disperse and the media moved in for interviews, Sarah reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She had boarded United Flight 847 as a tired colonel seeking anonymity and rest. She was leaving it as something more, not just because of the emergency landing, but because of what the experience had revealed about the bonds that connect strangers in crisis, the communities that form around shared purpose, and the quiet heroism that exists in ordinary people when extraordinary circumstances demand their best. 6 months later, Sarah would stand before graduating cadets at the Air Force Academy and tell them that service isn't something you put on with your uniform, but standing on the tarmac at Denver International Airport, surrounded by the faces of people whose lives had been changed by 3 hours in a damaged aircraft, she was still learning that lesson herself. The legend of Phoenix had grown that day, but more importantly, 127 people had been reminded that in moments of crisis, ordinary Americans, whether wearing the uniform of their country or the casual clothes of a weekend traveler, will step forward to serve something greater than themselves. The ripple effects of that truth would spread far beyond one emergency landing, touching lives and inspiring service in ways that Sarah Martinez, the reluctant hero of Seat 13F, would never fully know.